Now, one thing that's kind of inefficient in the previous demo and the way we're doing things is we're setting the data context multiple times for individual controls. So here we're setting the data context of the window as a whole to be a customer, but then we have to set a separate data context on the list box and a separate data context on the data grid itself. Generally, when you're doing data binding, you're going to try to aggregate all of the objects needed to support a given screen onto some single object you can set as a data context. And that kind of leads to the MVVM pattern, the model view view model pattern. Now, I'm not really going to go into any detail on MVVM, model view view model, in this course, because I want to emphasize that everything about data binding you can leverage even if you don't embrace the MVVM pattern, or perhaps you go do MVC or MVP as other patterns you could use. Data binding can still help you out there. But just to show a very lightweight form of MVVM is if we declared an instance of a main window view model here, and we go look in the code and this thing is actually already defined, and you can see it has the customer that we need for part of the screen, order dates that we need for another part of the screen, and order items that we need for another part of the screen, all just exposed as properties on that view model. Now, when you really do MVVM, you're generally going to encapsulate down on your view model the interaction logic and also the data loading and saving kind of logic inside of the view model and get that out of the code behind so it's more testable. But at a minimum here, to support a little bit better data binding, you need to aggregate all the data the screen needs on a single object so that you can set an instance of that single object as your data context. So if we go modify the code a little bit more, we've got this instance of the view model available to us now. Once we get our first customer, we'll set that as the customer property on the view model. And we'll get rid of this data context setting. And then once we have our order dates, we'll set those as the order dates property on the view model. And down below in our order selected, we can set the order items property on the view model to that set of order items for the current order. Now all we need to do is set the data context as a whole to an instance of that view model. Now that data context will be set at a window level and it'll flow down to all of the child controls. That implies that we need to change some of the bindings over here in our XAML. So first off, each of these bindings for customer I could prefix with customer dot, and it would go to that viewModel.customer to get the object and then get to the last name property on there. And then I'd have to say customer.firstname down here and so on. Another way I could do the same thing is because all these controls are grouped inside of this grid, I could just go to the grid and set the data context to the grid using a binding to the customer property on our view model. So it basically grabs that object reference, sets it as the data context, and everything underneath this grid now will just see the customer, not the view model. Then I could go down to my list box and change the binding to point to the order dates property on the view model, and go down to the data grid and change that one to point to the order items. Now if we go ahead and run, you can see we've got the same kind of experience up at the top as we had before. But notice when I'm making selections in the order date list, we've got a problem. It's not actually doing anything down below. You can see that we are still setting the order items property here when an order selection happens. So what's the issue there? Well, it kind of leads into our next module and working with data sources. But the problem is that we're setting this property, and this is a normal property, and it doesn't raise any kind of change notification. So even though the value of that property is changed when our event handler fires, the data binding doesn't know anything about it. Now, as a quick workaround, and to show you something we'll cover later in the course, we could force it to update. If you've worked with older technologies like Windows Forms, you may have seen methods called invalidate and variations on that force the form to re-render itself. This is kind of the data binding equivalent of that. And you generally don't want to do this, but I just want to expose it as a quick workaround at this point. We can go to the data grid itself. We can use a method called getBindingExpression that we pass a reference to a dependency property exposed on that. So the item source property that we were setting is actually a dependency property on the data grid. And when we say getBindingExpression, it goes to that dependency property and gets the underlying binding that's setting it. So you're effectively getting a reference to this binding object here. Then on that binding object, there is a method exposed called updateTarget. Again, remember the terminology of source and target. Source is the underlying data source object, which is our view model here. Target is the property on the element that's being set. So by saying updateTarget here, it's forcing it to grab the current value out of the source and set it again on the target. and that forces the UI to update. So with that in place, we can run, we can make our selections, and down at the bottom, you can see the grid is updating, even though our layout's not that great now. So that code will work, but it's not very efficient. We'll see in the next module, the better way to do this is to support iNotify property change and collection change notifications from your data-bound objects.